The cruelest betrayals do not begin with shouting. They begin with a smile held 1 second too long, with a hand not reaching for yours when it should. On the night of their 5th wedding anniversary, Nia Brooks Whitmore stood beneath the gold light of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom and understood, with a clarity that felt almost holy, that a woman could be abandoned without ever being left alone in a room. Crystal chandeliers glowed above her like frozen stars. A string quartet played something soft and expensive near the marble staircase. Servers moved through the crowd with silver trays balanced on white-gloved hands, and the air smelled like champagne, roses, and money old enough to have forgotten kindness. Nia wore a satin gown the color of deep midnight, simple and elegant, the kind of dress that did not beg to be noticed because it already knew its worth. Ethan stood beside her in a custom black tuxedo, tall, polished, unreadable, every inch the man magazines called brilliant and disciplined. But Nia knew the colder truth about him. Ethan Whitmore could control a boardroom with one glance, could move millions of dollars before breakfast, could silence a room full of investors with a single sentence, and yet when it came to his family, he became a man who mistook silence for peace. Vivian Whitmore lifted a champagne glass and tapped it gently with her ring, a bright little sound that cut across the ballroom like a blade wrapped in silk. Conversations faded. Heads turned. Ethan did not move. Nia felt his shoulder near hers, felt the warmth of his body through layers of silk and tailored wool, and hated that something so close could already feel so far away. Vivian smiled the smile she saved for charity luncheons and public cruelty. She praised the hotel, praised the guests, praised the Whitmore name, then let her gaze drift to Nia with a sweetness so polished it made the room feel colder. She called Nia beautiful first, because women like Vivian always wrapped the insult in ribbon. Then she laughed softly and said some people were lovely to look at, but never truly built for legacy. A few guests glanced down into their glasses. A few looked at Nia with pity they hoped resembled discretion. Claire Whitmore, always eager to please her mother, added that elegance could be bought, but breeding could not. That was when the laughter came, thin and shocked and quickly smothered, the kind that lived in people who were relieved the humiliation belonged to someone else. Nia did not flinch. She kept her spine straight. She kept her chin lifted. She kept one hand around the stem of her untouched champagne flute and waited for the man who had promised to love her in every room to finally become her husband. Ethan exhaled once, almost tired, and leaned toward her just enough for no one else to hear. His voice was low, even gentle, which somehow made it worse. "They are still my family, Nia." In that instant, the music kept playing, the glasses kept sparkling, the ballroom kept glowing, but something inside her went still. Not broken. Still. As if her heart had stopped running toward a door that was never going to open. She looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, and saw not a villain, not a monster, just a man too weak to interrupt the people who wounded her, because their approval still fed some starving part of him. And Nia knew, with the calm certainty of dawn arriving after a brutal night, that this would be the last evening she ever stood beside him and called it love. By the time the applause returned and Vivian moved on to thanking donors, Nia no longer heard the quartet, the glasses, or the polished laughter rolling through the ballroom like nothing sacred had just been broken. She set her untouched champagne flute on a passing tray and smiled at the nearest guest with such calm grace that no one would have guessed she was already leaving in her heart. Ethan stayed where he was, one hand in his pocket, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere beyond her, as if avoiding her pain could make him innocent of it. Nia did not create a scene. That was the part they would never understand. They had expected anger, tears, maybe even pleading. They did not know that a woman reaches a far more dangerous kind of clarity when she finally has nothing left to explain. She walked through the ballroom with measured steps, satin brushing softly against the marble floor, past tables dressed in ivory linen and candlelight, past floral arrangements taller than children, past photographs of a marriage the Whitmore family had always treated like an unfortunate public relations risk. In the private elevator, she pressed the button for the penthouse and watched the mirrored doors close on the only version of herself that had still been hoping Ethan might choose her in front of the people who had spent years cutting her down one elegant sentence at a time. Upstairs, the silence felt different. It was not luxurious anymore. It was empty. The penthouse stretched around her in cold perfection, all glass walls and city lights, every surface spotless, every object expensive, and none of it warm. Nia stepped out of her heels near the entryway and crossed the living room barefoot, the hem of her gown whispering over the hardwood floors. On the dining table sat the anniversary arrangement she had chosen that morning, white roses in a crystal vase, already beginning to open. She stared at them for a moment, then laughed once under her breath, not because anything was funny, but because she suddenly saw how much energy she had spent decorating rooms that had never learned how to hold her safely. In the bedroom, she unzipped her gown and changed into a cream cashmere sweatsuit, folding the dress with care even though no one in that family had handled her heart with half as much respect. Then she opened the safe, removed her passport, her jewelry case, and the small envelope where she kept the backup key to an apartment she had rented months earlier in Charlotte after one too many Sundays at the Whitmore estate had taught her that survival sometimes begins as a quiet contingency plan. Her hand paused when she reached for the velvet ring box on the dresser. Ethan had given her that ring under summer lights in Napa, promising that with him she would never have to earn a place at the table again. Nia slipped the diamond from her finger slowly, feeling the pale band it had left behind on her skin. She carried it into the dining room, placed it on a crystal bread plate beside the roses, and left no note. There was nothing left to clarify for a man who had watched her humiliation and called it family loyalty. At 3:20 in the morning, she rolled a single suitcase across the penthouse floor. At 3:45, the elevator doors opened into the underground garage. By 4:05, she was driving through the sleeping city with the skyline shrinking in her rearview mirror, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting flat against her abdomen, as if protecting a future she could not yet name. The sun had not risen yet, but for the first time in years, Nia felt something stronger than grief moving through her. It was not revenge. It was peace, still fragile, still tender, but real enough to follow. Charlotte received her in gray morning light and the soft hiss of rain against the windshield. By the time Nia pulled into the covered garage of the furnished apartment she had quietly secured months earlier, the city looked half awake, all wet pavement, red brake lights, and coffee shops beginning to glow behind fogged windows. She turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, both hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the sudden silence after hours of highway noise. No one called. No message lit up her phone. For all Ethan Whitmore's power, for all the reach of the Whitmore name, the first thing that met her disappearance was not pursuit. It was absence. Nia carried her suitcase upstairs alone. The apartment was modest by every standard she had lived with during her marriage, barely 1,000 square feet, with pale walls, clean counters, and a narrow balcony overlooking a line of maple trees just beginning to turn. But when she stepped inside, something in her chest loosened. It did not smell like old money and polished disapproval. It smelled like fresh paint, linen spray, and possibility. She set her bag by the sofa, drew the curtains halfway open, and let herself stand in the center of the room without rushing to become anything for anyone. Hours later, after a shower and 3 failed attempts to drink coffee, she leaned both palms against the kitchen counter and closed her eyes. Her body had been trying to tell her something for days. The fatigue, the nausea, the strange tenderness she had dismissed as stress. By noon she was sitting in a quiet urgent care office with a paper wristband around her arm, watching rain slide down the window in crooked lines. A nurse with kind eyes and a sunflower pin returned with the results and smiled in the careful way people do when they are about to hand someone a future. "Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently. "You are pregnant." For a second, Nia did not breathe. The room did not spin. It sharpened. The hum of the fluorescent lights. The faint scent of antiseptic. The ticking second hand on the wall clock. Pregnant. The words settled into her like both a wound and a miracle. She pressed a hand over her mouth, not to hide tears, but to hold in the force of everything changing at once. While another woman might have reached for her phone, might have called the father first, might have believed a child could repair what loyalty had failed to protect, Nia only looked down at the folded printout in her hands and knew that whatever came next had to be built somewhere cruelty could not reach so easily. Back in New York, Ethan found the ring just before noon. It sat on the crystal bread plate beside the roses that had opened fully overnight, bright and indifferent in the daylight streaming across the dining table. The penthouse was too neat, too empty. Her gowns were gone. Her passport was gone. The drawer where she kept private letters from her late grandmother stood open and cleared out with deliberate precision. He called once, then twice, then 10 times. Each call went unanswered. Vivian told him she was being dramatic. Claire said she would come back when she was ready to apologize for embarrassing the family. But Ethan stood in that silent dining room with the ring in his palm and felt, for the first time, that something had left him which money could not summon back. In Charlotte, Nia placed the clinic printout inside a kitchen drawer, then opened her laptop at the small dining table and began making lists. Doctor, attorney, prenatal vitamins, new bank account. She did not know exactly what motherhood would ask of her yet, only that it deserved a home where love did not have to beg permission to stay. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later by overnight courier, heavy cream envelope, Ethan's name embossed in dark blue at the corner, as if even the ending of a marriage had to look expensive. Nia stood at the kitchen counter in her Charlotte apartment, morning light falling across the unopened package, and felt no shock at all. Only confirmation. Ethan had not come himself. He had not asked where she was, whether she was safe, whether the woman he once swore to protect had eaten, slept, or cried. He had sent attorneys. The paper inside was clean, precise, bloodless. Irreconcilable differences. Division of assets. Confidentiality language tucked between lines about property and timing, as though the deepest humiliation of her life could be handled like a merger dissolving under polite legal terms. Nia read every page once, then again. The baby changed everything, but it also clarified everything. She would not go back to a man who needed an audience to recognize her worth. She would not raise a child inside a family that treated dignity like something granted only to those born into the right last name. Her own attorney in Charlotte, a sharp, warm woman named Dana Mercer with silver braids and a voice steady as stone, reviewed the documents that afternoon. Dana did not ask invasive questions. She only circled a few clauses with a fountain pen and said, very quietly, "You do not have to sign away your peace just because they have money." It was the first time since leaving New York that Nia felt the presence of something stronger than survival. Support. Real support. They revised the terms, tightened the language, removed what needed removing, and by sunset Nia had signed her name with a hand that did not shake. Brooks. Then Whitmore. The ink looked like a bridge between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Ethan called while she was sliding the papers back into the envelope. His name lit up her phone across the table, familiar and impossible. For a long second, she watched it ring. Then she let it go dark. A moment later, a message appeared. "We need to talk." Another followed. "This is getting out of hand." Then, after 10 quiet minutes, a third one. "Nia, please." That last word nearly undid her, not because it moved her, but because it arrived too late, soft now only because he had finally felt the edge of consequence. She did not answer. Instead, she took the elevator downstairs and walked 2 blocks to a neighborhood pharmacy where the automatic doors opened with a warm rush of heated air. She bought prenatal vitamins, ginger tea, unscented lotion, and a small spiral notebook in pale blue. Back home, she sat cross-legged on the couch beneath a fleece blanket and opened the notebook. To the first page, she wrote one sentence in neat, careful letters. "You were loved before anyone knew your name." The words blurred for a second, and she pressed her palm against her lower stomach as if the child could somehow feel the promise through skin, muscle, and fear. Outside, evening settled over the maple trees, street lamps blooming one by one in amber circles against the cold. In New York, Ethan stood alone in his office with the city spread beneath him in silver glass and winter haze, reading the revised documents his attorneys had just sent over. For the first time, the language did not feel like control. It felt like distance. Nia was not bargaining. She was not threatening. She was simply gone, and every line she signed without him made that truth harder to deny. In Charlotte, she turned off her phone, curled deeper into the blanket, and chose, with a calm that surprised even her, to build the rest of her life in a place where silence no longer meant surrender. Autumn settled over Charlotte in slow layers of gold and rust, and with each passing week Nia learned that healing was rarely loud. It sounded more like the kettle beginning to sing in her kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, like the soft scrape of a pen across her notebook, like the quiet reassurance of routine returning to a life that had been shaken but not destroyed. She kept her world small on purpose. Doctor appointments, grocery runs, calls with Dana, long walks beneath trees, shedding copper leaves onto the sidewalks of Dilworth. At 14 weeks, she sat in a dim examination room with one hand wrapped around the edge of the paper-covered table while the ultrasound technician adjusted the screen and smiled without saying too much. Then came the sound, fast and steady, a tiny wild rhythm filling the room with proof. Nia stared at the monitor as the grainy image flickered into focus, and all at once the fear she had been carrying like a stone inside her shifted into something warmer, something brighter. "There you are," she whispered, so softly that only she and the child could hear it. The technician printed 2 images and handed them to her, with the same tenderness some people reserve for sacred things. Nia slipped them into her purse, as if she were protecting light itself. She did not send them to Ethan. She did not send them to anyone in New York. Instead, she stopped at a bakery on the way home and bought a single slice of lemon cake, then ate it at her kitchen table while rain tapped gently against the window and the ultrasound photos rested beside her teacup. It was the simplest celebration she had ever had, and maybe because it belonged to no one else, it felt complete. By then, a few people had begun to notice her. Mrs. Alvarez downstairs, who wore bright cardigans and always smelled faintly of cinnamon, started leaving containers of vegetable soup outside Nia's door with handwritten notes telling her to eat more iron and rest when she could. On Saturday mornings, Nia visited a small black-owned bookstore and coffee shop 3 blocks away, where the owner, Patrice, eventually learned her order and never asked the wrong questions. There was kindness in Charlotte that did not pry, kindness that did not treat her pain like entertainment. It simply made room for her to breathe. And in that room, she began to think beyond survival. At her dining table, with a laptop open and spreadsheets glowing late into the evening, Nia started consulting quietly for 2 women-owned businesses she had met through a former client. One sold handmade skincare products. The other ran a struggling event brand with excellent taste and terrible strategy. Nia helped them tighten messaging, renegotiate contracts, and protect themselves from the kind of polished exploitation she now recognized instantly. Money began to come in, not Whitmore money, not the reckless luxury of private jets and penthouses, but honest money tied directly to her mind, her instincts, her labor. It steadied something in her. Some nights, when the baby turned softly beneath her ribs and the apartment glowed with lamplight instead of chandeliers, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by leaving, but by building. In New York, Ethan sent flowers twice and 1 letter through legal channels. Nia declined the flowers and never opened the letter. She had spent too many years mistaking delayed tenderness for love. Now she understood that love, real love, arrived on time. When she pinned the first ultrasound photo to the inside of her bedroom drawer that night, she stood there for a long moment, fingertips resting against the wood, and promised the child, growing inside her, that they would never have to audition for belonging. Winter arrived the week Nia went into labor, sharp and silver over Charlotte, with a hard rain tapping against the windows and cold settling into the tree branches outside her apartment like glass. She had spent the afternoon answering client emails at her dining table, one hand moving across the keyboard, the other resting absently over the curve of her stomach, when the first real contraction stopped her mid-sentence. It was not dramatic. It was deep, steady, undeniable. She closed her laptop, breathed through it, and looked around the apartment she had made into a life. The folded baby blankets on the armchair, the bassinet beside her bed, the tiny cotton sleepers washed in fragrance-free detergent and stacked in neat rows inside the dresser. Everything was ready, and still she felt the ancient tremor of stepping into something there was no way to fully prepare for. Mrs. Alvarez drove her to the hospital just after sunset in a small sedan that smelled like peppermint and clean upholstery. She kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on Nia the whole way, speaking in the calm, grounded voice of a woman who had guided people through worse nights than this one. At the hospital, warm light pooled across polished floors, and nurses moved with the practiced gentleness of people who understood that lives could change completely in a single shift. Nia checked in under Brooks, not Whitmore. When the receptionist asked for the father's information, Nia paused only briefly, then said she would complete the paperwork later. The truth was not shameful. It was simply hers, and she was tired of handing pieces of herself to systems that treated women like open files. Labor stretched across the night in waves that demanded everything and gave nothing back except progress measured in patience. Between contractions, she listened to the monitor's steady rhythm and the quiet voice of her nurse, a black woman named Celeste with soft brown eyes and a silver cross at her throat. Celeste pressed a cool cloth to Nia's forehead and reminded her to breathe low and slow, like she was sending calm all the way down to the child. There were no chandeliers here, no polished cruelty, no family name hovering over the room like a threat. There was only effort and mercy and the raw, holy work of bringing someone new into the world. Near dawn, with rain still streaking the hospital windows and the sky beginning to pale at the edges, Nia heard the first cry. It was thin at first, then strong, filling the room with a sound so fierce and alive that every lonely mile, every unanswered call, every paper she had signed alone seemed to rearrange itself around that one moment. Celeste placed the baby against her chest, warm and impossibly small, wrapped in a striped hospital blanket. Nia looked down and saw dark curls damp against a tiny forehead, soft brown skin, and a mouth already shaped with stubbornness. Then the baby opened her eyes, and Nia's breath caught. Even newborn and blinking against the light, there was something achingly familiar there. Not enough to wound her, just enough to remind her that love and grief sometimes shared the same face. "Hello, baby girl," she whispered, tears slipping silently into her hairline. "I have got you now." She named her Naomi Grace Brooks before the sun had fully risen. Grace for what had carried her this far. Brooks for the woman who had learned that survival could become legacy if she held it long enough. Later that morning, alone except for the sleepy hush of the maternity floor and the bundled child breathing softly in her arms, Nia signed the birth certificate with a hand that felt steadier than it had in years. No Whitmore appeared on the line. No one had earned that place. As pale winter light spread across the room, Nia kissed Naomi's forehead and understood that the life she was building was no longer only about escape. It was about inheritance, and she intended to pass down peace. 5 years can turn survival into structure if a woman is allowed to build in peace. And by the time Naomi Grace Brooks started kindergarten in a navy cardigan and patent leather shoes, Nia had become the kind of woman people trusted before they even knew why. Her apartment had long since been traded for a sunlit townhouse with tall windows, pale oak floors, and a narrow garden where rosemary and lavender grew along the brick path. Mornings began at 6 with oatmeal on the stove, jazz low from the kitchen speaker, and Naomi at the table swinging her legs and asking questions too big for daylight. Questions about clouds, about names, about whether brave people were ever scared. Nia always answered honestly, "Yes, baby, most of them are." Then she would smooth Naomi's curls into neat puff ponytails, button her coat, and walk her to school beneath the Carolina sun, one small hand tucked inside her own. After drop-off, Nia crossed town to the offices of Brooks Advisory, the firm she had started with one folding desk, one laptop, and an understanding of image, language, and crisis that had been sharpened in rooms where she was never meant to win. Now the firm occupied the 3rd floor of a restored brick building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows, warm wood conference tables, and a staff of 12. Most of them women who had been underestimated somewhere before walking through her door. They helped founders, nonprofits, and growing brands recover from public mistakes without losing their dignity. And Nia had become known for something rare in that world. She did not traffic and spin. She told people the truth in a voice steady enough to be useful. By October, a national business magazine had named Brooks Advisory one of the most promising boutique firms in the Southeast. Nia accepted the recognition the same way she accepted everything now, with gratitude, precision, and no illusion that applause meant safety. At home, the magazine cover ended up face down on the kitchen counter because Naomi needed the space for crayons and a construction paper moon she was cutting out for class. That evening, while tomato soup simmered and rain traced silver lines down the windows, Nia checked her email one last time and saw the sender name that made her hand go still above the trackpad. Whitmore Foundation. She stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then sharpened again. The message was formal, polished, and almost offensively respectful. The foundation was hosting its annual winter gala in New York to stabilize donor confidence after a damaging series of public missteps and leadership criticism. They wanted Nia Brooks, founder and chief strategist of Brooks Advisory, to appear as keynote speaker on reputation, trust, and rebuilding after institutional failure. Her fee was listed without negotiation. First-class travel included. Private accommodations available upon request. It did not mention Ethan. It did not mention Vivian. Nia did not need the email to say their names. She could feel them between every line. Naomi padded into the kitchen in pink socks and climbed onto a bar stool with a library book tucked under her arm. "Mama," she asked, "are you working again?" Nia closed the laptop halfway and looked at her daughter, at the warm brown skin, the bright, curious eyes, the little crease between her brows when she sensed something serious moving through the room. "Just thinking, sweetheart," she said. Naomi nodded and opened her book upside down before correcting it with great dignity. Nia almost smiled. Then her phone lit up with a second message, this one from Patrice at the bookstore cafe, who had forwarded the gala announcement with 3 words beneath it. "They know now?" Nia did not answer right away. She turned back to the rain, to the smell of basil and soup, to Naomi humming softly over the wrong page, and understood that the invitation was not really an invitation. It was a mirror being carried back into the very house that had once refused to see her clearly. For 2 days, Nia left the email unanswered. She moved through her life with the same measured grace she had taught herself in harder seasons: school drop-off, client calls, grocery lists, bedtime stories. But the invitation sat at the edge of every thought like a match near silk. On the 3rd morning, after walking Naomi into her classroom and watching her disappear beneath a paper snowflake display with a backpack nearly as big as her torso, Nia stood for a long moment in the parking lot under a pale December sky and accepted what her spirit had already decided. She was not going back to reclaim anything. She was going back to prove that what they had tried to diminish had survived without them. She replied before noon. Her terms were simple. Full speaking fee paid in advance to Brooks Advisory. 1 suite, not at a Whitmore property. A child-friendly schedule. No private family meetings. No press questions outside the agreed event. The foundation accepted within an hour. Of course they did. By Friday, Manhattan was cold enough to sting the lungs. Nia stepped out of the car in a camel coat, heeled boots clicking lightly against the curb, one gloved hand holding Naomi's as the city rose around them in glass. And winter light. Naomi wore a cream wool coat with brass buttons and a navy velvet headband, and she looked up at the buildings with wide-eyed delight, as if New York were made entirely of stories. "Mama, it looks like the sky lives here," she said, and Nia smiled despite herself. It was the first time she had brought her daughter into the city where so much of her old life had been buried. But this time she was not entering as someone's wife. She was arriving under her own name. The gala was held in the restored Grand Astor Ballroom, not the Whitmore Hotel, but the room carried the same old language of wealth. White orchids climbed across mirrored tables. Candlelight shimmered in long rows. A chamber ensemble tuned softly near the stage. Men in dark tuxedos and women in satin moved through the room with the polished ease of people trained never to reveal discomfort in public. Nia noticed the discomfort anyway the moment she entered. Heads turned. Conversations faltered, then resumed in lower tones. Recognition moved through the ballroom like wind through tall grass. Naomi stayed close at her side, one small hand tucked into Nia's fingers, patent leather shoes flashing beneath the hem of her dress. Nia had arranged for a private sitter in the adjoining lounge until speech time, but Naomi had begged to see the big room first, just for a minute, and Nia had agreed. Sometimes dignity includes letting joy breathe before the world interrupts it. Across the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore turned from a conversation with 2 donors and went completely still. 5 years had refined him into something quieter and more visibly tired. The arrogance had not vanished, but grief had sanded down its shine. His tuxedo was perfect. His posture was perfect. Only his eyes betrayed him. They found Nia first, and all the air seemed to leave his body at once. Then they dropped to the little girl beside her. Naomi chose that exact moment to tilt her face up toward Nia and ask whether the chandeliers were real crystal. did not speak. He simply stared as the color left his face so completely that one of the donors beside him turned and asked if he was all right. Nia met his gaze across the room and felt no panic, no triumph, no urge to hide. Only the deep, settled calm of a woman who had already endured the worst room in her life and learned how to walk through brighter ones without fear. Then Naomi squeezed her hand and smiled up at her, and Ethan understood the part that hurt most. Nia had not only survived his silence. She had built a world so full of love that his last name had become unnecessary. When Nia stepped onto the stage that night, the ballroom settled into the kind of silence money could never buy. Only respect could. The lights warmed her face, soft gold against the winter dark beyond the tall windows, and for one suspended second, she saw everything at once. The donors lifting their attention toward her, the foundation board sitting straighter in their chairs, Ethan standing near the back with one hand braced against the edge of a table as if the room itself had shifted beneath him. Nia adjusted the microphone and began exactly the way she had built her new life, without spectacle and without apology. She spoke about trust, how institutions fail when they confuse image with integrity. She spoke about what happens when powerful people protect comfort instead of truth. She spoke about repair, not as performance, but as repetition, the daily choice to become someone safer than you used to be. The room listened because every word came from a place deeper than expertise. It came from having survived the cost of being treated as disposable and choosing not to disappear. By the time she finished, the applause rose slowly, then fully, a standing ovation that rolled through the ballroom in waves. Nia accepted it with a nod, then walked off stage with the same calm she had carried into the room. Naomi ran to her first in the adjoining lounge, throwing small arms around her waist and looking up with shining eyes. "Mama, you sounded like church and thunder," she said, and Nia laughed softly, bending to kiss her forehead. Check corridor where the noise of the gala faded into a hush of carpet, distant glassware, and winter air slipping under the revolving doors. Naomi was with the sitter a few steps away, curled sleepily against a wool blanket with one patent leather shoe half undone. Ethan stopped several feet from Nia, as though some part of him finally understood that remorse did not grant access. Up close, the years were clearer on him. Not age, exactly. Wait. The kind a man carries when memory has stopped flattering him. "I know," he said quietly, and the words fell between them without ornament. Nia did not ask what he meant. She did not need him to explain the child, the timing, the face he had recognized from across the room like a judgment he had authored himself. He swallowed once and looked toward Naomi with a tenderness so late it almost hurt to witness. Then he looked back at Nia. "I was a coward," he said. "I thought keeping peace with them would cost less than standing up for you. I was wrong. I have been wrong every day since you left." Nia held his gaze, not cruel, not soft, simply clear. The old version of her might have mistaken confession for transformation. This woman did not. "Wanting forgiveness is not the same as becoming trustworthy," she said. Ethan nodded like a man receiving a sentence he had rehearsed for and still could not bear. "I am not asking you to come back," he said. "I do not deserve that." The glass. Ethan remained where he was, under the fading glow of a gala meant to rescue a family name, while the woman they had once belittled walked away, carrying something far more powerful. Not revenge, not victory. Proof. Proof that a woman who leaves with nothing but her dignity can still become the safest place her child has ever known.